Hearing there in Eyewitness News breaking this morning, the president accepting the resignation of Andrea Johnson as the head of the investigating directorate against corruption. There was, of course, very damaging testimony before the Madlanga Commission last week and mounting complaints over Andrea Johnson's own conduct. She joins a growing list of anti-corruption leaders who have left office early. It's raising the questions about whether South Africa's corruption-fighting institutions are in fact structurally set up to fail. But is this simply another case of interference, or does it expose maybe the deeper flaws in how we build and restore and protect our anti-corruption agencies? Dr Oscar van Heerden joins me now. Oscar, really appreciate your time. Was expected last week that Andrea Johnson would not be in a job long. In fact, a week ago you had the Minister of Justice, Mameloko Kubai, writing to the president to suggest or recommend the suspension of Andrea Johnson. But is this an honourable exit, or is simply this the unavoidable consequence of her own very embarrassing testimony before the Madlanga Commission last week?
Good morning, Kiewit, and good morning to your listeners. Yeah, no, it's clearly a dishonourable exit. And I say dishonourable because it's not only about her testimony, but we also increasingly heard of her conduct while she was head of IDAC, the kind of shenanigans she used to get up to with all kinds of unsavory characters and so forth. So I think it's a combination of embarrassment in terms of the testimony being questioned around some stuff, but also about her own conduct. And this is now the result, yet again, as you say, an early exit for someone.
If you look back at the Scorpions, the Hawks, the SIU, in fact, Andrea Johnson's predecessor, Hermione Cronje, also had an early exit. Why do South Africa's anti-corruption institutions seem unable to enjoy any type of sustained stability?
You know, I think, Lester, it's a combination of issues. There's obviously, to a certain extent, political interference in some of these institutions. There's factionalism that plays out in the ruling party. And then, of course, there's just downright corruption, criminal elements within these institutions. And, you know, the Scorpions was a very effective agency. It was given broad sweeping powers. And I think that it simply just scared some of the political types. And that's why they decided it must be dismantled and be reincarnated into a different form. And since then, we've continuously had problems with all the subsequent institutions that have come to try and replace it.
Is there any real independence when you have the NPA, when you have the SIU, when you have IDAC, all these anti-corruption institutions and prosecutorial bodies? Is there real independence when your budget is controlled politically? There is a Department of Justice budget, and that department then allocates to the various entities. It was, in fact, Hermione Cronje who said that she resigned from the job simply because of resources, and there wasn't enough resource support. She said that we're not being given the tools to adequately fight corruption. Are any of our bodies, in fact, 100% independent?
Yeah, look, I mean, it's a very difficult one, Lester, because, you know, if you look at other countries, they are supposed to operate independently. They are supposed to have an independence with regards to fear and favor and so forth. Of course, there's always the constraint, which is that the budget is being provided by government, by the treasury and so forth. But I don't think that necessarily means that there's control being exercised over those institutions. You know, for me, I think it is about leadership. I think that when President Ramaphosa appointed Batoy, for example, after we clearly had the incompetence of Abrahams and so forth prior to her during the Zuma administration, there was a lot of expectations on very many people that she is the one that's going to begin to provide the necessary leadership and begin to arrest people and put people behind bars. Unfortunately, towards the end of her tenure, she then suddenly comes and tells us that there's infiltration in the NPA and there's other forces at play. I mean, this is now after many years of being at the helm of the institution. So it sounded like an excuse, as far as I'm concerned, for not having done what she was supposed to do.
Does making you a successful prosecutor make you automatically a successful administrator, particularly against corruption? We look at Andrea Johnson. She had been part of and won several high-profile cases. If we look at Brett Keble and JCI fraud and theft, she was in fact on the team that prosecuted and sought a conviction of the former South African police chief, Jackie Salibi. She has been involved quite with a detailed hand in many successful high-profile prosecutions. Never seem to have materialized when being the head, the administrative head of a prosecutorial, but essentially a crime-fighting unit.
Look, I mean, this is something that's going to haunt us in South African society and in other countries as well, which is that, does it take a doctor, a medical doctor, to effectively run a hospital? Is that person qualified to do so? Similarly to your question, because you are a good prosecutor, does it mean that you are a good administrator and a manager? We know, for example, that you have very excellent lecturers at university, but the minute you put them in an administrative position, they are pathetic. So this is something that will haunt us for a long time, and trying to get that balance right of the right person that has the necessary qualities, but also does possess the managerial experience. So it's something that I don't think we are getting right in many respects.
Is it simply the case that corruption and those who want to protect corruption are so deeply entrenched in our society that I have very little imagination of how we get out of that, but there's and not just in our public sector, but in the private sector as well. And there's I think a very, very important critique. Message says with regards to Andrea Johnson's resignation, Yuri Roo summarily resigned from SA Rugby in 2022. After an embezzlement case, but 40 months later he was back again working for SA Rugby as a consultant. That's just an example of it's not just the public sector, but in the private sector as well. Is corruption so deeply embedded in who we are as a country that, I don't know, it's almost the troubles of Sisyphus trying to make inroads against corruption, but then all of a sudden the boulder keeps running downhill again?
It's going to, and I know many of your listeners are going to call in and comment on this. It's not trying to make an excuse, but the problem, Lester, is that the political economy of corruption runs deep and long in South Africa. It comes from the apartheid system. The kind of problems that we are seeing with the Madlanga Commission, for example, where the South African police service is endemic in terms of itself being a criminal syndicate, comes from the apartheid era already. The corruption that was there in the Nationalist Party and so forth, and the continuation of that. And of course, not trying to make excuses, post-1990, post-1994, one of the things that we undermined at its very core was the power of money. We have a brilliant constitution, we had all kinds of Chapter 9 institutions put in place, etc., but we simply did not bargain on the lure of money and how it will corrupt us.
We watch the Madlanga Commission as if it's some linear soap opera. It's a Netflix show, and when you watch Hollywood, you identify with a villain and a hero. And a hero or a Superman comes in and swoops in and he saves the day. I think what we as South Africans, Oscar, have to realize that in this country, there are no true villains, there are no true heroes. that we should stop waiting for some form of Superman to try and save us. I don't know if that's your assessment as well, but if I look at some of the comments and the live commentary from the public, oh, this person dropped a bombshell. Yes, they must be the good guy. Next day, as someone offers an alternative testimony that counters that yesterday's bombshell in South Africa, and particularly this investigation by Judge Madlanga, we have to come to terms with the reality in South Africa. There are no heroes.
No, absolutely. I mean, and we also need to, there are no heroes, and we also need to move away of thinking that we have a savior in the form of the President of the Republic or the Minister or the General. It is not. It doesn't work like that. What is required in South Africa, Lester, is collective leadership. It's a leadership that is supposed to be ethical and moral, and it's a leadership that must take difficult decisions to put us on the right trajectory. That, unfortunately, is what is lacking in South Africa.
Dr. Oscar van Heerden, really appreciate your time.